Before the Shadow of the Earth Tree came out, I made my massive Soulsborne FromSoft boss tier list where I covered almost all the bosses outside of some like very minor ones. Of course, I wanted to do something for the DLC as well, so I've picked out basically what I'd consider the major bosses. It doesn't have quite all of them because I mostly want to stick with the ones that are actually fresh. And for context, at this point I've put over 100 hours into this DLC. I've beaten it numerous times with all kinds of challenge runs like Rune level 1, Shield only without rolling, and Scadutree level 0, stuff like that. And also spell builds themed around the new weapon types, etc, etc. So I've seen these bosses from multiple different perspectives with multiple different builds. I know a lot of people rushed out these lists as soon as the DLC came out, but I really wanted to take my time with this and get to know how all of them really work. And I'd like to think I've done a pretty good job at that. If I made this list after my first playthrough, I can say for sure that it would have looked extremely different. Only a handful of bosses would have been in the same place they are now, and many of them would have ranked multiple tiers above or below their current placement, so things have changed quite a bit. So let's stop wasting time, kick things off with the first boss of the DLC, Divine Beast Dancing Lion. A boss I definitely enjoyed more on my first playthrough, mostly because it's such a spectacle. It's all the different phases it goes through, the different elements, it has a really unique moveset, the soundtrack matching the element switching, all really cool, but nothing really fixes the main issue of this fight, which is that the visibility and the camera can just be really, really bad. Some of my fights and some of the clips I've seen from this guy have been pretty wild, when the camera just goes completely nuts so you can't see anything that's going on, and that really takes away from the whole fight for me. But you can play locked off. You can play in a way where you're very passive against the boss and you back away a lot and the camera is a bit of a less of an issue. Still, that doesn't make the fight more fun in my opinion. A lot of the things that make it more manageable make it less fun. Like the lightning phase, the ice phase, both of those pretty dangerous. You should play more safe during those. But even though phase 2 with the element switching is really cool, a lot of that just makes the fight more tedious in my opinion, but I'm not gonna say it's a bad boss, definitely not. In theory, I kind of want to put this in good tier, but the reason why I'm gonna end up going for okay is actually the other Divine Beast fight. This fella, on my Rune level 1 playthrough, the most annoying boss in the game, absolutely infuriating to fight against due to them spawning the basilisks. I just really had a bad time. Granted, that's a challenge run. On a normal playthrough, not as much of an issue. The effect of this guy being in the game kind of bleeds over to the other one, since there's two of the same boss. It's less unique, and their only real difference is that one of them spams ads. So this guy, I definitely want to put in meh tier. I don't like this guy. Next up, the Death Knights. I put them both in the bundle here. I think these guys are probably the best dungeon fight in the game, like an optional dungeon fight. They remind me of the Crucible Knights in many ways, but I think these guys are better than the Crucibles, and they're basically covering for Godwyn, or the lack of Godwyn in the DLC. And I really wish we had a third one of these that really like ramped things up, because it felt like they were building up to something with there being two of them, but we never get a third one, and that's a real bummer, because I genuinely like this fight a lot. I prefer the first version with the dual axes. He has a fun, varied moveset. His design looks really cool. The arena is cool with Godwyn's like death form on the background. Theoretically, you could say it's a weakness that this guy can get stun locked by colossal weapons or just backstab chained, but I'd argue that it's nice to have a boss where you can have all kinds of different playstyles. Like parrying works pretty well here. As I said, backstabbing, stun locking spells, like you can tackle this fight in all kinds of different ways, even though it is a pretty simple fight. And I actually really like their grab that heals them. Usually healing abilities are kind of bullshit, but since that one is technically easy to avoid, but it makes it such a threat. Like if you get hit by that, it gains basically half its health back. But I think it's a really cool ability. So honestly, the dual wield version gets a great tier. For the two-handed axe version, most of my praise applies to this guy too, but on a few of my playthroughs, I've seen his AI break, where he just starts standing still, and you can just wail on him until he dies. I think they may have patched that out, but that has somewhat soured my experience with this version, And I also don't think his moveset is quite as fun as the other one. So if the other one is like a very low great tier, I think this is a pretty high good tier boss. I do like him quite a bit. Rellana, the Twin Moon Knight. Definitely the boss that destroyed a lot of new players when the DLC first came out. I didn't struggle too much with it, and on my repeat playthroughs, I've always found her really fun. Basically with every build I've played, Rellana has felt somewhat different, and I've enjoyed different things about it, but it mostly just comes down to the flow of the fight and the variety of her moveset. Since I think she might have the most dynamic moveset from any boss in the game. Like how she reacts to what you're doing. It's really interesting to actually just look at her moveset and how it works and try to find the punish windows because they're there, but she hides them pretty well. You can also jump a lot of moves, you can crouch under some certain moves. Like there's a lot to like about this, and her Moon Blast that basically will kill you on your first playthrough is a really cool move. And the fact that it's actually not very difficult to avoid, it's just very punishing, makes it so that it doesn't feel as bullshit. Her music also excellent. I will be saying that a lot. I basically liked her a little more after every playthrough. On my first one I would have put her in Great, mostly due to the fact that she lacks a cutscene, which takes away some of her like presentation value, but mechanically she's just so good that I've ended up liking her more and more as time has gone by. So Rellana has definitely found its way into the amazing tier for me. The Golden Hippo mostly just feels like a little speed bump on your way to fight Messmer. Overall, I find the fight to be mostly inoffensive, outside of a few camera issues due to the boss just being so big. But when you learn his moveset, and you definitely will, since the hippos are a pretty common enemy in the DLC, I think it's a fine fight. It's nothing to write home about, just like slightly above average. So it's not bad. I know a lot of people hate this fight for some reason, I'm not really sure why. Maybe it was partially due to at launch him having the charge attack basically up and ready as soon as you enter the fog gate. But nowadays you get a bit of a breather in the beginning. So I think that's fine. On my first playthrough I think I would have put into like one tier lower. But with the change they made so that it's a bit less annoying to start the fight, I think I'm willing to put this guy in the bottom of OK tier. It's fitting to have the two animals next to each other, right? Even though one of those is just two guys in a suit, but still. It's the thought that counts. The Divine Beast is on like the very top of OK tier, and this dude is on the bottom. Putrescent Knight. Once again a boss that I've definitely grown to like more on repeat playthroughs. He has a very unique moveset, and he does kind of force you to chase him around. But it's interesting that my Rune level 1 playthrough was the one where I really started to like this fight. Since they do have punish windows in a bunch of their moves, like you can jump over and roll into specific directions to catch them, like while they're running away from you. But you do still spend quite a bit of time chasing them around. The fight is at its best when he's being aggressive and doing those corkscrew attacks, because that's a really fun move to avoid. The fire you can jump over is a bit unintuitive on your first playthrough, but when you realize the gimmick of that, they're pretty easy to avoid and actually pretty fun too. So this is a guy that's definitely gone up since my first playthrough. Back then I would have probably put them in like okay tier-ish, but nowadays I think it's a good boss. But it feels like it's missing something. The phase 2 doesn't change all too much about the fight. I almost wish they went all in and actually made it into a gank boss, since the DLC didn't do one of those. I was hoping that they redeemed themselves with the duo fights in the DLC, since the main game's duo fights were very disappointing. Putrescent Knight I think could have been a good spot to do that, but they didn't, so as is, I think it's a good fight. Probably gonna put it above the two-handed axe Death Knight. Definitely a good boss overall. Here comes probably the most controversial part of the video. Commander Gaius. A boss that a lot of people really dislike. And on my first playthrough, I think he wasn't anything to write home about. And there are clear issues with this fight. Like his charge attack having a shit hitbox, and he can do multi-hits on you. All of those, pretty annoying. I wish he had his own music. Gaius is officially the only boss that gets a minus point in terms of music, because he just has the basic field boss theme, and he definitely could have had something different. But the thing is, I like fighting Gaius. I think when you're actually in the zone, and purely from a mechanical perspective, I'd even call him a great boss. You just have to stay close to him. I see a lot of people use Torrent and run away from him and gain distance, and that's such an unintuitive way to fight this guy, since so many of his moves leave pretty big punish windows if you actually just stay close to him. You can also find healing windows if you're close to him. Like, the most dangerous place to be is mid-range and far range. Being close to him also prevents him from doing a lot of his most annoying attacks, since even his charge is a lot easier to avoid when you're right next to his face. His phase 2 gravity slam, you can just dive through that and get a huge punish. Like, his punish windows are surprisingly big if you stay close to him. A lot of his melee moves are really satisfying to avoid, especially his big melee combo, since if you time those dodges well, you can get a pretty big punish at the end. In a way, I'd like to even put this guy into great tier, but I do admit the few faults that he has, as in the music, the hitbox, and the multi-hits, do kind of drag him down. So I'm gonna put him into very high good tier, but he's like 1 or 2 patches away from being a great boss in my opinion. I doubt they'll add the music, but I don't see a reason why they wouldn't change the charge hitbox or just remove him having multi-hits on a few of his attacks. If they fix those 2 things that I mentioned, this would easily be a great boss in my opinion. But in the current version of the game, as things stand, I'll put him here. But Gaius is definitely an overhated boss. He was actually a highlight during my Rune level 1 playthrough. Next up, the Embrace of Messmer's Flame. Messmer is fantastic. What can I say? Everyone loves him for a good reason. His fight is definitely a highlight in the DLC. He doesn't have almost any real big flaws. Like, his moveset is really fun to dodge. He's fun to play with different builds. The story significance is huge. He has really good music in it. His cutscenes, voice acting, presentation, everything is just top notch. Like, his phase 2 snake transformation is fucking wild. And it's also wild that it works as well as it does. There is definitely a timeline where the phase 2 of this fight becomes a complete mess. But luckily we're not in that timeline, and the phase 2 is, I think, more fun to fight against than phase 1. And phase 1 is already super fun. So Messmer, I have no real complaints. I love this boss fight. I always look forward to this boss fight. And the only, I guess, criticism, if I have to pick one, is that if you level up your shadow level too high before you fight him, it can make him a tad too easy. Because you can burst him down pretty quick with certain builds. So maybe just a tad more health would have been even better. But as I said, minor nitpick. I love this fight. And I'd honestly put him into my all-time top 10. On the lower end of it, closer to spot 9 or 10, but still in the top 10. Romina. This is an interesting case because she often doesn't get to shine when people play through the DLC once, because there's a good chance she's going to be one of the last bosses you meet in the DLC, and she shines the most when you do the fight early, or if you do it with a challenge run of some sort. Because Romina has a really fun moveset to dodge. The entire presentation of the fight is honestly really great. In many ways she feels like a Dark Souls 3 boss in terms of the fight's flow, and I really like the flow of Dark Souls 3 bosses in general. So I'm a big fan of how this fight feels. Her music, mixing in the Melania motif, is also a nice touch. Brings the Scarlet Rot theme together. There's just a really nice flow in the fight with her flying around, and there's typically pretty good punish windows, even during her attacks, since you can jump over some of the centipede stuff. I just really, really like this fight. Yeah, pretty much the biggest flaw of this fight is that it's too easy if you do it at the end of the DLC. So if you really want to enjoy this fight at its best, play this early in the DLC. You'd be surprised how difficult some of her moves are to dodge. And if you're doing it on a low health character, you don't really have the luxury of just face tanking things. I do wish she had her own cutscene or even voice acting, since in terms of story, it kind of feels like she comes out of nowhere. She does have a reason to be there, but on an average playthrough, if you're really not paying attention, she kind of just appears like, hey, it's me, the centipede lady. She could have just had something. But as things stand, I think Romina is still really great. Next up, another boss that definitely is more fun if you do it early, the Scadutree Avatar. Another boss that can just explode if you're doing it at the very end of the DLC. On my very first playthrough, this boss was nothing to write home about, since I went into it with fire spells and a fire-based weapon, so his health bar pretty much just got nuked. So I didn't have a strong opinion on this fight after that, but the following playthroughs have definitely showcased the quality of this fight, since he has a lot of moves that are surprisingly tricky. But learning how to avoid a lot of his moves in a way where you position yourself next to his head so you can get bigger punish windows is pretty satisfying actually. So you can either choose to get easy hits on his body, or try to get better positioning and get bigger damage from his head. I really like that. The flow of this fight is pretty fun. The gimmick with the 3 phases, also kind of funny that they gave this fella 3 phases. But the music and the way it transitions between the phases is surprisingly good. For some reason, they gave this thing like the saddest theme of the DLC. I'm not sure why killing the flower got the most somber music of the DLC, but in a way it fits. Because you see the flower like lose its power in phase 3 when it goes for those like big explosions, like it's trying its best to kill you. And I really like this. I know a lot of people don't, but once again, I'd recommend doing this fight a bit earlier if you want to get a better experience from it, since you actually have to learn the fight instead of just nuking it at the end of the DLC. I also really like how the arena looks. The official Deus Ex Human Revolution sponsored colors are a nice touch. If I did this list after my first playthrough, I think this guy would have landed closer to OK tier or something. But now, after multiple challenge runs and really fighting this guy quite a lot, I find him pretty great. So I'm going to put him between Romina and the Death Knight. Alright, now that I've talked about bosses that I actually really liked, it's time to talk about something that I'm not a huge fan of. Metyr, the Mother of Fingers, is, in my opinion, just kinda annoying. This is one of those fights that I basically never really look forward to. The design is cool. It has a lot of really cool looking attacks. So visually, I can't fault this fight at all. But there's just something about it. I just don't find this fun to fight against. A few of her moves are a real bitch, like the spinning Beyblade and the full arena covering phase 2 transition, and of course the black hole attack that's nearly impossible to avoid unless you play very passively and try to keep away from her. Or you have, I think, 2 specific Ashes of War. Every other option will have you eating shit against that move, and at least until they change that, so it's less annoying. And them just spawning the ads is the final cherry on the top of the cake that I don't really like to eat. So Metyr finds her home in the Metyr. I guess it's fitting. And following that up, we have something that I like even less. Jory, the Elder Inquisitor. I'm not sure who it is at From Software that loves the boss archetype where it just runs away from you and spams magic, but I can tell you, I'm not one of those fans. The optimal tactic against this guy is just to chain backstab him, and that's very lame. If you try to engage with the fight, like really, you let them do their stuff and you actually like try to play normally, it's just really tedious. So, I don't know. Jory has a really cool arena. He's a cool introduction to the Abyssal Woods, but that's pretty much all he gets. Outside of that, he's just a lame magic spammer. So yeah, pretty bad. But, luckily, the Abyssal Woods have a second boss that definitely did not disappoint. Midra, the Lord of the Frenzied Flame. The depths of your foolishness. This guy, I'm pretty sure they kept the little guy in the beginning of this fight, just so he can keep saying that. So it adds a bit more character to Midra himself. And From likes to have those like iconic lines in certain boss fights. So I'm pretty sure that's the only reason the little dude is there. But what comes after that is my favorite fight from the DLC. The flow of this fight, the music, the cutscene, everything, literally everything about this fight, I'm a huge fan of. Like, he has very clear punish windows, and you can also hit him mid-combo, so you're rewarded for playing aggressive. All kinds of different builds work really well against them. He has a bunch of moves you can crouch, like his spinning Beyblade attack. I think his phase 2 transition when he does the sun bomb is insanely cool looking. Him just turning into the sun, basically. He's just the full package. And the best thing about the whole thing is the music. The whole atmosphere around this fight gets such a massive boost when that music kicks in during his phase transition and then just improves and improves and improves, and it's such a good boss theme. Like, the amount of strength and like bass in this track is nuts. It really sounds like a Bloodborne soundtrack, and I love Bloodborne's OST. It's my favorite music from the DLC, and it's a top 3 track for Elden Ring itself. It's honestly kind of shocking how well this boss actually comes together, since it's easy to see a version of this boss that completely sucked ass. You know, since he does frenzy attacks, like, this could have been something that's incredibly annoying to fight against if the fight just revolved around his status effect. But now I think how they implemented the frenzy into this fight just makes it more intense, since it's something you have to keep your eye on, because if he procs that frenzy on you, there's a good chance you just explode. But getting hit by it means that you've made multiple mistakes. And all of this just culminates beautifully when the music is also building up in intensity. You see the frenzy bar build up, you're pretty much one hit away from death if he procs that on you. The fight reaches its peak and it's just so good. Is it a perfect boss fight? No, it has a few nitpicks. Like, killing the little guy in the beginning, I can see that being a bit tedious, but I think his voice line is funny, so I'm okay with it. But his biggest downside is that he's too easy to stagger. So if you have a build that completely revolves around just staggering bosses, you can kind of just demolish him. But I don't think these small blemishes hurt the fight too bad in my mind. And as I've stated already, I can't glaze this boss enough. I love Midra, and I'd put him just slightly above Messmer. It's also interesting that they had such a long build-up to this battle. Typically, in From games, they may have had long build-ups to like main story bosses, but it's cool that they have pretty much a side location on the open world just to hype up one boss. And someone else who does that even better is Bayle the Dread. Bayle is definitely a contender for the best dragon fight in the series, but for me personally, I still prefer Metyr a little more. But I think it really comes down to just personal preference in this case. Bayle is definitely the coolest dragon fight though. Like, this fight is badass as hell. It's nice to have a dragon boss where you're supposed to focus on his head again so you can actually see what they're doing. It took them a couple of years to relearn that lesson, but I'm glad we got back there. His fire lightning moves are all extremely cool looking. If we were just talking about the spectacle of the fight, Bayle might just take the cake as the most cinematic boss out of any FromSoft game. However, that spectacle also brings some issues with it. The camera can also be a bit of a bitch in this, since if you stay in front of him, it's typically fine. And if you're far away from him, no problems. But as soon as you go under his body, the camera is a complete mess. Luckily, as I said, From was pretty smart when it comes to designing this guy. So if you fight him in the most optimal way, where you avoid his attacks in a way where you don't end up under him, and instead you're more so next to his head or in front of his head. At that point, the camera things are not really a big issue, and you're also doing the most damage as you're hitting his weak point. The music sync when he powers up in phase 2 is just mwah, chef's kiss. And just his phase 2 attacks in general are insane to look at. But I think that's also where some of his problems come in, since he can spend a lot of time just doing his big blasts and just jumping around and not really giving you a lot of windows to get good hits in. Like, he does typically have punish windows at the end of things, but sometimes he just likes jumping around the arena a bit too much. I think this may have already been fixed. I'm not sure since I haven't seen it in a while, but at least during my first playthrough and near the launch, his fire used to do like a weird split sometimes, where even if you're sprinting to the side, his fire just suddenly diverts its direction and hits you no matter what. That was just complete bullshit, but I'm going to assume that's been fixed, since I haven't seen that happen in a long time. Egon is also a nice addition to this fight. He does add to the whole cinematic perspective and makes this more of a spectacle with his screaming and yelling and all that. I think he does make it a bit too easy by taking aggro from Bayle, so I personally prefer fighting him without because of that. But I do have to give respect to my boy for being the best hype man in the Souls series. So yeah, an absolute spectacle of a boss fight. It seems that the common opinion around this boss is that Bayle took the crown from Placidusax and is now the best dragon fight in Elden Ring. And I agree with that. And the last two, Leda and Friends. Technically not a boss fight, I know, but come on. It's basically a boss fight. This is definitely something where your own choice affects if this is gonna be enjoyable or a nuisance. This fight really just comes down to the fact that, will you use the summons? Have you completed the NPC questlines? Let's say if you completed all of those and you summon the guys, it's a pretty fun time. It's probably about as good as an NPC fight can be. It's a nice conclusion to the story of all the NPCs, and overall, it's very unique. I really like it. Downside, all the people, like myself, who don't personally like to use summoning on their first playthrough, will have a pretty bad experience, most likely, just kiting the enemies around for 5 minutes, because fighting multiple NPCs solo is really annoying. Still, it does have the story significance, so I don't want to fault it too much because of that. And the music, once again, fantastic. I'm actually kind of shocked how good the soundtrack of this fight is, considering it is a room full of NPCs. They really popped off for this one. Honestly, I think they should have just forced the NPCs into the fight if you did the questlines. If you didn't do them, then you could have that one guy there as like a backup. But if you did everyone's questline, I think the NPCs should have automatically been summoned in. So they wouldn't even give you the choice of getting a worse boss experience. If you did this fight with the NPCs, I'd definitely put it like here-ish. If you're doing it solo, it's somewhere like here. So I'm gonna average things out and put it here. There are not many times when I'd say the summon version is the better version of a fight, but this is one of those. So if you want to have a good fight, take the summons. And finally, the most controversial boss, maybe in all of From Software's games, promised Consort Radahn. The vast majority of the discussion surrounding this boss revolves around 4 things. His phase 2 flashbangs making it really hard to see, his cross slash move being a piece of shit, him just being Radahn again instead of something more fresh for the final boss of the DLC, and him being very aggressive and lacking punish windows. Am I going to argue against any of those? Nope. I have the same issues with all of those. I think the holy effects and just not being able to see properly in phase 2 is pretty lame. It's an annoying way to make the fight more difficult. The crush last combo is the single most annoying move in the game. There are many situations where it's actually just unavoidable unless you have very specific items. You have to be hugging his leg, and it can make the fight just less fun because it limits how you can play it, since you have to be ready for his one bullshit move. However, I do actually like Radahn. His phase 1 is really great. I have no real issues in phase 1 except the cross slash. But all of his other moves are pretty fun to actually dodge, and in many of them he leaves enough of a gap where you can get like a poke in and do damage in between his attacks. Slower weapons definitely do struggle here, because it's much harder to find those punish windows. But faster weapons have a much more of a fun time, since you can find those little gaps in between his combos where he can do damage. And it's just really fun to learn, and a lot of that carries over to phase 2, since most of his combos are still similar, and a lot of the same tricks do still work. Yes, in phase 2 there's a lot more you have to also worry about. A lot of his moves can be unclear, like the light clone attacks. It will most likely take you time to learn how each of those work, but when you've done the fight a lot of times, as I have, I specifically wanted to do this fight on rune level 1 without blocking or parrying. So I actually had to learn how to dodge all of his shit. And yes, it took quite a while. Almost 200 tries. And I didn't have a bad time. Wait, no, wrong clip. There's also the music and the entire spectacle of this fight, which I think are both really great. Like him busting out the meteor right at the end of the fight is basically a jump scare, since you pretty much know that it's over. I've lost when he jumps into space. But that move is pretty easy to handle when you actually learn how it works. Just run away, so it's not really an issue. I do find it kind of funny how out of all builds, the Dark Souls 1 wall build, combined with the Sekiro deflecting tier, pretty much demolishes this boss. Out of all the builds I've used in this boss, just doing the shield only was actually probably the easiest fight I've had. It can be a little cheap, but not everyone is a challenge runner. Some people just want to beat the boss, so it's nice that they at least have some option that serves as like an easy alternative for this boss fight. Something that isn't bleed plus frost, because that typically tends to be the easy solution to everything. So for once, it's something different. I can definitely see that there is a great fight hidden in here, somewhere below the flashbangs flashing in your face. He's definitely a flawed boss fight. However, I do see the potential in this fight. He's fun when you learn him, and he's definitely very satisfying to beat, and he's currently the hardest boss From has ever made. But yeah, I really like Radahn. I don't like him enough to put him in the great tier right now, but he's in a similar place as Gaius, where I think he's one patch away from landing like here-ish. But as of right now, I think he lands in very high good tier next to Gaius. Who knows, maybe they will actually do some patches to this stuff, since they did patch Elden Beast quite a bit. So maybe in the future I'm gonna be placing him higher. Future me here. Turns out FromSoft decided to pull a fast one on me and released an update right when I was editing this video. And they specifically made a lot of changes to the one boss that I talked the most about, Promised Consort Radahn. They fixed quite a few of the things I actually mentioned originally, as in the Crush Lash is no longer the worst move in the game. It's actually completely dodgeable now, and actually feels pretty good to dodge since you get a big punish at the end. And they also added quite a bit of end lag to a lot of his other moves, so you can actually play the fight quite well with colossal weapons too. So I played him once with a colossal sword build, just to test them out, and I had a pretty good time with that. So yeah, Promised Consort Radahn is actually pretty great now. His flashbang effect on a lot of his clone moves and a lot of the faith moves, not as bad as he used to be, so they toned that down. You can actually see without sunglasses. So basically the biggest issues of the fight just got fixed, and I'm a man of my word. I said that if Radahn got these changes, I'd raise him up to great tier, and that's definitely what I'm gonna do. We'll see if my feelings will change over time. But as of right now, I think this is where I'd place Radahn. But yeah, that wraps it up. Overall, I really like the bosses of this DLC. Messmer and Midra are my two new favorite Elden Ring bosses. Bayle is the best dragon fight in Elden Ring. In general, I think the boss quality was just pretty high. So I was definitely pleased with the offerings that this DLC had. And as always, this list was officially approved by Miyazaki himself. So if you disagree with my placements here, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you may have to update your opinion, my man. This is the official one, so might wanna have to change yours. I don't make the rules, that's just how it is.